I never thought that the worst day of my professional career would end up leading to the most satisfying moment of justice I've ever experienced. But sometimes, the universe has a way of balancing things out in the most unexpected and dramatic ways possible. What started as a devastating public humiliation that nearly destroyed my confidence and my career became the catalyst for a complete reversal of fortune that left my former tormentor literally begging me for mercy. And honestly, I'm still processing how dramatically everything changed in just 6 months. My name is Michael. I'm 35 years old, and until 8 months ago, I worked as a senior software engineer at a mid-sized tech company called Dataflow Solutions. I'd been with the company for 4 years, steadily working my way up from a junior position to become one of their most reliable and productive developers. I genuinely loved my work, took pride in delivering high-quality projects on time, and had built solid relationships with most of my colleagues and clients. I thought I was building a stable, successful career at a company that valued my contributions and saw me as a long-term asset to their team. But everything changed when the company hired a new chief technology officer named Richard Blackwood, who came in with big promises about revolutionizing our development processes and taking the company to the next level. Richard was one of those executives who looked impressive on paper. Harvard MBA, previous experience at several high-profile tech companies, and a resume full of buzzwords about digital transformation and innovative leadership strategies. The company's board was clearly excited about bringing him on, and there was a lot of internal communication about how his expertise would help us compete more effectively in our market. From day one, Richard made it clear that he intended to make significant changes to how our department operated, and unfortunately, his approach seemed to be based more on establishing dominance and control than on actually understanding the existing systems and processes that had been working well for years. He immediately started criticizing established workflows, questioning decisions that had been made before his arrival, and making sweeping pronouncements about how things needed to be done differently without taking time to understand why they'd been done that way in the first place. Richard's management style was aggressive, condescending, and focused on public displays of authority rather than collaborative problem-solving or team-building. He had this habit of calling impromptu meetings where he'd pick apart projects and decisions in front of large groups, using them as opportunities to demonstrate his supposed expertise while making the people who'd done the actual work look incompetent or short-sighted. He seemed to enjoy putting people on the spot with loaded questions designed to make them look unprepared or confused, and he'd follow up with lengthy explanations of how he would have handled things better. I initially tried to give Richard the benefit of the doubt, thinking that maybe his harsh approach was just his way of establishing expectations, and that he'd soften his style once he got more comfortable in his role. I'd worked with demanding bosses before, and I understood that leadership transitions could be challenging for everyone involved. I focused on doing good work, meeting his requirements as clearly as I understood them, and trying to be supportive of the changes he wanted to implement. But it quickly became apparent that Richard had singled me out as a particular target for his criticism and micromanagement. He'd scrutinize my code more thoroughly than anyone else's, question my technical decisions in front of other team members, and make subtle comments about my work ethic and competence that were designed to undermine my reputation within the company. When projects I'd worked on were successful, he'd minimize my contributions or give credit to other team members. When there were any problems or delays, he'd place disproportionate blame on my decisions or approach. The situation was frustrating and demoralizing, but it was also confusing because I couldn't figure out what I'd done to earn this kind of treatment. My performance reviews had always been excellent. I'd never had significant conflicts with previous managers, and my colleagues seemed to respect my work and value my contributions to projects. I started wondering if there was something about my communication style or approach that was rubbing Richard the wrong way, and I tried adjusting my behavior to be more deferential and accommodating to his preferences. If you've ever worked for someone who seemed determined to make your professional life miserable for no apparent reason, You probably understand how isolating and stressful that experience can be, and I'd love to hear how others have dealt with similar situations because it can feel pretty hopeless when you're in the middle of it. The tensions between Richard and me continued to escalate over several months, and I started to realize that this wasn't just a personality clash or adjustment period that would resolve itself with time and patience. Richard seemed genuinely committed to making me look bad and pushing me out of the company, though I still couldn't understand his motivations or what he hoped to accomplish by targeting me specifically. I considered talking to HR about the situation, but Richard was careful to keep his criticism within professional bounds, and I was worried that complaining about my new boss would make me look like I couldn't handle feedback or adapt to change. Breaking point came during a quarterly review meeting that included not just our development team, but also representatives from other departments, senior management, and several important clients who'd requested updates on projects they'd commissioned from us. It was the kind of meeting where everyone was supposed to present their recent accomplishments and discuss upcoming initiatives. And I'd prepared thoroughly to discuss several successful projects I'd led over the past few months. I should have realized that Richard was planning something when he asked me to present last, after everyone else had shared their updates and the room was full of people who'd been sitting through presentations for over an hour. But I was focused on doing a good job with my presentation and representing our team well in front of the clients and senior management, so I didn't pick up on the warning signs that should have alerted me to what was coming. My presentation covered 3 major projects that had been completed successfully over the past quarter, including technical details about the challenges we'd overcome, the solutions we'd implemented, and the positive feedback we'd received from clients and users. I'd put together detailed slides with metrics showing improved performance, reduced costs, and enhanced functionality that had resulted from the work my team had done. Everything had gone smoothly. All the projects had been delivered on time and within budget, and the clients had expressed satisfaction with the results. But when I finished my presentation and opened the floor for questions, Richard immediately launched into what can only be described as a calculated public assassination of my professional competence and character. He started by questioning basic technical decisions I'd made, not in a constructive way that might lead to productive discussion, but in a way that implied I was incompetent and had somehow gotten lucky that the projects had worked out despite my poor judgment. Richard then pulled out a folder of printed emails, code reviews, and project documentation that he'd apparently been collecting for months, and began reading selected quotes out of context to make it sound like I'd been consistently making mistakes, missing deadlines, and causing problems for other team members. He'd taken routine technical discussions and presented them as evidence of confusion or incompetence on my part. He'd highlighted minor issues that had been quickly resolved and presented them as major failures that had required extensive cleanup by other people. The most devastating part of his attack was how he presented normal aspects of the development, process, debugging, code revisions, collaborative problem solving, as evidence that I was struggling to meet basic professional standards. He made it sound like every project I'd worked on had been a disaster that had been salvaged only through the intervention of more competent colleagues, despite the fact that all these projects had been completed successfully and had received positive reviews from clients. But Richard wasn't finished. He then launched into a broader critique of my attitude, work ethic, and fit with the company culture, suggesting that I was resistant to feedback, difficult to work with, and potentially holding back the team's progress and innovation. He made comments about my communication style, my approach to collaboration, and my ability to adapt to new processes and technologies that were designed to make me sound like a liability rather than an asset to the company. The room was completely silent during this 15-minute character assassination, with everyone clearly uncomfortable but unsure how to respond to such an unexpected and vicious attack. The clients looked confused and embarrassed, my colleagues seemed shocked, and the senior management representatives appeared to be trying to figure out whether this was some kind of performance review gone wrong or whether there were serious competence issues they needed to be aware of. I was so stunned by the scope and intensity of Richard's attack that I couldn't immediately respond effectively. I tried to address some of his specific criticisms, pointing out that many of his examples were taken out of context or misrepresented normal aspects of the development process. But I was clearly rattled and defensive, and my attempts to clarify or correct his mischaracterizations probably made me look even more incompetent and unprofessional. Richard concluded his presentation by suggesting that while everyone made mistakes and had areas for improvement, the patterns he'd identified in my work raised serious questions about whether I was the right fit for the senior role I'd been occupying. He said that he'd be working with HR and senior management to develop a performance improvement plan that would help address these concerns, but that everyone should understand that the company's standards and expectations were evolving as they grew and faced increased competition. The aftermath of that meeting was the most humiliating and isolating experience of my professional career. Word of Richard's public takedown spread quickly throughout the company, and I could tell that people were looking at me differently, wondering whether there was truth to his criticisms and whether I was actually as competent as they'd previously thought. Some colleagues were sympathetic and tried to offer support, but others seemed to distance themselves from me, probably worried about being associated with someone who'd been so publicly criticized by the CTO. The performance improvement plan that Richard and HR developed was clearly designed to set me up for failure rather than actually help me improve my performance. It included unrealistic deadlines, vaguely defined objectives that could be interpreted subjectively, and requirements for documentation and approval processes that would make it nearly impossible to complete projects efficiently. I was also required to attend weekly meetings with Richard where he could monitor my progress and provide additional feedback about areas where I needed improvement. These weekly meetings were torture sessions where Richard would pick apart everything I'd worked on, question my judgment and competence, and make increasingly clear that he was building a case for my termination. He'd ask loaded questions about why I'd made certain decisions, then interrupt my explanations to point out better approaches I should have taken. He'd criticize my attitude and responsiveness to feedback, suggesting that my defensive reactions to his criticism showed that I wasn't coachable or willing to grow professionally. I started looking for other jobs immediately after the public humiliation, but the job market was challenging, and I was worried that references from my current employer would reflect Richard's negative assessment of my performance. I was also dealing with significant damage to my professional confidence, second-guessing decisions I'd previously made instinctively, and wondering whether maybe Richard was right about some of my weaknesses and blind spots. The stress of the situation was affecting every aspect of my life. I was having trouble sleeping, losing weight from anxiety, and becoming increasingly isolated from friends and family who were tired of hearing about my work problems. My girlfriend at the time suggested that maybe I should just quit and take some time to figure out what I wanted to do next, but I was determined not to let Richard drive me out of a job and a career that I'd worked hard to build. About 3 months into the performance improvement plan, I had what I thought would be my final meeting with Richard. He'd found new reasons to be dissatisfied with my work, including complaints about projects that had been completed successfully, but not according to his preferred methodologies. He was clearly preparing to recommend my termination, and he seemed to be enjoying the process of systematically destroying my career and reputation. But then something unexpected happened that changed the entire trajectory of this story and revealed information that put Richard's behavior toward me in a completely different context. During our meeting, Richard received a phone call that he thought was urgent enough to take despite our scheduled discussion. He stepped into the hallway to talk, but he left the door partially open, and I could hear his end of the conversation clearly. What I heard was Richard talking to someone about a consulting contract he'd been secretly working on while employed at Dataflow Solutions. He was discussing client requirements, project timelines, and payment arrangements for work he was apparently doing on his own time using knowledge and resources from his day job. The conversation made it clear that he was essentially competing with his own employer taking on projects that could have been opportunities for data flow while using his position and access to company information to give himself unfair advantages. Even more damaging was what I heard about his motivations for targeting me specifically. Richard was apparently worried that I was competent enough to potentially uncover his side business, or that I might be promoted to a position where I'd have oversight of his work and could discover his conflicts of interest. His campaign to destroy my reputation and force me out of the company wasn't about my performance at all. It was about protecting his ability to continue his unethical and probably illegal side consulting work. I immediately started recording the conversation on my phone, capturing Richard's discussion of specific client names, project details, and payment amounts that clearly demonstrated he was violating his employment agreement and potentially engaging in corporate espionage. When he returned to our meeting, I acted like I hadn't heard anything unusual. But I was already planning how to use this information to protect myself and expose his misconduct. Over the next few days, I did some careful research to verify what I'd learned from Richard's phone conversation. I discovered that he'd incorporated a consulting business under a slightly different name just 2 months after being hired at Dataflow Solutions, and that his client list included several companies that were direct competitors of our employer. I also found evidence that he'd been using company resources, including proprietary software and confidential client information, to support his consulting work. Armed with this evidence, I requested a meeting with the CEO and the head of HR to discuss some concerns I had about conflicts of interest within the company. I presented the information I'd gathered in a professional and factual manner, including the recorded conversation, the business registration documents, and evidence of Richard's consulting activities that violated his employment agreement and potentially exposed the company to legal and competitive risks. The company's leadership was shocked by the evidence I presented, and they immediately launched an internal investigation into Richard's activities. Within a week, they'd uncovered even more evidence of his misconduct, including emails he'd sent from his company account to consulting clients, expense reports he'd submitted for costs related to his side business, and documentation showing that he'd been sharing confidential information with competitors. The investigation also revealed that Richard's aggressive management style and his targeting of certain employees, including me, had been motivated by his need to eliminate potential threats to his consulting operation. He'd been systematically undermining people who were competent enough to potentially discover his activities or who might compete with him for senior positions that would give them access to information he wanted to keep hidden. When confronted with the evidence, Richard initially tried to deny the allegations and claimed that his consulting work was completely separate from his employment responsibilities. But the documentation was overwhelming, and it became clear that he'd been blatantly violating his employment agreement and potentially engaging in criminal activity by stealing proprietary information and client lists. The company terminated Richard immediately and began legal proceedings to recover damages from his consulting activities and to prevent him from using confidential information he'd stolen. They also issued a public statement to clients and partners clarifying that Richard's activities didn't represent company policy and that they were taking steps to prevent similar breaches of trust in the future. But the most satisfying part of Richard's downfall was still to come. About 2 weeks after his termination, I received a phone call from Richard asking if we could meet to discuss the situation. He claimed that there had been misunderstandings about his consulting work and that he wanted to clear the air and potentially work together to resolve the issues that had led to his termination. I agreed to meet with him, partly out of curiosity about what he could possibly say to justify his behavior, and partly because I wanted to see how he'd handle being in a position of weakness after months of using his authority to humiliate and intimidate me. We met at a coffee shop near the office, and Richard's demeanor was completely different from the arrogant, domineering executive I'd been dealing with for months. He started by apologizing for the way he'd treated me, claiming that he'd been under tremendous pressure to improve the department's performance, and that he'd unfairly targeted me as a way of demonstrating his leadership and establishing his authority. He said that he'd realized his approach had been wrong and that he'd been impressed by how I'd handled the difficult situation with professionalism and integrity. But then Richard got to the real purpose of our meeting. He told me that he was facing serious legal and financial consequences from his termination and the subsequent investigation into his consulting activities. The company was seeking damages that could bankrupt him, and he was also facing potential criminal charges for theft of proprietary information and violations of computer fraud statutes. He needed someone who understood the technical aspects of his work at Dataflow Solutions to help him prepare his legal defense and potentially negotiate a settlement with the company. Richard then made the most surreal request I've ever received in my professional career. He asked if I would be willing to work as a consulting expert witness to help him defend against the charges the company was bringing against him. He said that my technical expertise and my familiarity with the projects and systems he'd worked on would make me the ideal person to help him argue that his consulting work hadn't actually harmed the company or violated his employment agreement in any meaningful way. The irony was incredible. The man who'd spent months systematically destroying my professional reputation and trying to force me out of my job was now asking me to help save his career and potentially keep him out of prison. He was essentially begging for my help, offering to pay me consulting fees that were more than I'd made in months of regular employment, and promising that he'd provide positive references and recommendations to help repair the damage he'd done to my reputation. I let Richard finish his entire pitch before I responded, and I have to admit that I enjoyed watching him squirm as he tried to convince me that helping him would somehow be in my best interest. He clearly understood that I was probably the only person with the technical knowledge and inside information necessary to provide an effective defense of his actions, and he was desperate enough to put aside his pride and ask for help from someone. He'd treated terribly. My response was simple and direct. I told Richard that I appreciated his apology, but that I had no interest in helping him defend against charges that were based on his own unethical and illegal behavior. I pointed out that his consulting activities had indeed harmed the company by creating conflicts of interest, exposing confidential information, and potentially steering business opportunities away from his employer toward his personal ventures. I also made it clear that his treatment of me and other employees had been unprofessional and destructive, motivated not by legitimate performance concerns, but by his need to protect his ability to continue his misconduct without detection. I told him that while I didn't take any pleasure in seeing him face serious legal consequences, I also wasn't going to help him avoid accountability for his choices and actions. Richard's reaction to my refusal was a mixture of desperation and anger that revealed his true character even more clearly than his months of workplace bullying had done. He tried to argue that I owed him consideration because he was offering me a lucrative business opportunity, and that refusing to help him was petty and vindictive, given that his termination had already resolved the conflicts between us. When those arguments didn't work, Richard shifted to threats, suggesting that he could still damage my reputation within the industry and that refusing to help him might be seen as unprofessional or vindictive by future employers who learned about the situation. He said that helping him would demonstrate maturity and professionalism, while refusing would show that I was holding grudges and couldn't move past workplace conflicts. But I was no longer intimidated by Richard's attempts at manipulation and control. I told him that his threats and arguments only confirmed that I was making the right decision by refusing to help him, and that his inability to take responsibility for his actions without trying to blame or intimidate others showed exactly why he'd been terminated and why he was facing legal consequences. The conversation ended with Richard storming out of the coffee shop, clearly frustrated that his attempts to manipulate me into helping him had failed completely. But that wasn't the last contact I had with him, because his legal situation continued to deteriorate, and he became increasingly desperate for any assistance that might help him avoid the serious consequences he was facing. Over the next few months, Richard contacted me several more times, each time with increasingly desperate pleas for help and increasingly generous offers of compensation for my assistance. He tried different approaches, sometimes appealing to professional solidarity, sometimes offering partnership opportunities in future ventures, and sometimes just begging me to consider the impact that criminal charges and financial ruin would have on his family and his future. But each conversation only reinforced my decision to refuse his requests for help. Richard never showed genuine remorse for his misconduct or acknowledged the harm he'd caused to the company and to the employees he'd mistreated. Instead, he continued to minimize his actions, blame others for his situation, and look for ways to avoid accountability rather than accepting responsibility and working to make amends for his behavior. The final resolution of Richard's legal situation was even more satisfying than I'd expected. The company's investigation had uncovered evidence that his consulting activities had cost them several major client contracts and had potentially exposed them to liability for breaches of confidentiality agreements. The financial damages were substantial enough that Richard was forced to declare bankruptcy, and he ultimately pleaded guilty to criminal charges related to theft of proprietary information and computer fraud. Richard's career in the tech industry was effectively over. Word of his misconduct spread quickly through professional networks, and no reputable company would consider hiring someone with his record of ethical violations and criminal convictions. He was also prohibited from working in certain types of consulting or advisory roles as part of his plea agreement, further limiting his ability to rebuild his professional life. Meanwhile, my own career took a dramatically positive turn following Richard's termination and the revelation of his misconduct. The company's new leadership recognized that I'd been unfairly targeted and that my performance had never actually been deficient in any meaningful way. They formally removed the performance improvement plan from my record, restored my professional standing within the company, and provided compensation for the stress and reputational damage I'd experienced during Richard's campaign against me. More importantly, the CEO personally apologized for the company's failure to recognize and address Richard's misconduct sooner, and he asked me to take on additional responsibilities in helping to rebuild the department's culture and processes following the disruption caused by Richard's leadership. I was promoted to a senior technical leadership role with a substantial salary increase and expanded authority over project management and team development. The experience of surviving Richard's attempted destruction of my career and ultimately being vindicated when his own misconduct was exposed taught me valuable lessons about resilience, integrity, and the importance of documenting and addressing workplace abuse rather than simply enduring it. I learned that people who abuse their authority often have something to hide, and that their aggressive behavior toward competent employees is frequently motivated by fear and insecurity rather than legitimate performance concerns. I also learned that standing up for yourself and seeking justice for workplace mistreatment can be risky and difficult, but that it's often the only way to protect yourself and prevent abusive managers from continuing to harm other employees. If I hadn't been in the right place at the right time to overhear Richard's phone conversation, I might never have discovered the real reasons for his behavior toward me, and he might have succeeded in destroying my career while continuing his own unethical activities. The reversal of fortune that saw Richard go from a position of authority where he could humiliate me publicly to desperately begging for my help in avoiding criminal charges was deeply satisfying. But it was also a reminder that justice doesn't always come quickly or easily. It took months of enduring his abuse and nearly losing my job before the truth about his character and motivations was revealed, and the resolution only came through a combination of luck, preparation, and the company's willingness to investigate and address serious misconduct. The experience also taught me about the importance of maintaining professional integrity even when you're being treated unfairly or when you have opportunities for revenge against people who've wronged you. When Richard asked for my help in defending against the charges that resulted from his own misconduct, I could have agreed to help him and then sabotaged his case, or I could have publicly humiliated him the way he'd humiliated me. But taking the high road and simply refusing to help someone who didn't deserve my assistance felt more appropriate and ultimately more satisfying than any form of revenge would have been. My current position at Dataflow Solutions has given me the opportunity to help rebuild the company culture and ensure that the kind of abusive leadership that Richard represented doesn't take root again in our organization. I've worked with HR to develop better processes for reporting and investigating workplace misconduct, and I've tried to create an environment where technical staff feel supported and valued rather than intimidated or threatened. I've also become something of a mentor for other employees who are dealing with difficult managers or workplace conflicts, sharing the lessons I learned from my experience with Richard and helping people understand their rights and options when they're facing professional mistreatment. The experience of nearly losing my career due to one person's misconduct and insecurity has made me more aware of how common these situations are and how important it is for employees to support each other and speak up against abuse. The tech industry has a reputation for tolerating aggressive and demanding leadership styles, often excusing abusive behavior as necessary for driving innovation or maintaining competitive advantage. But my experience with Richard showed me that truly destructive managers are usually motivated by personal insecurities and hidden agendas rather than legitimate business objectives, and that their behavior typically harms rather than helps organizational performance. Companies that allow abusive managers to operate without accountability often lose valuable employees who could have contributed significantly to their success, while protecting people whose primary skills involve manipulation and intimidation, rather than actual technical or business expertise. The cost of Richard's misconduct to Dataflow Solutions went far beyond the immediate financial damages from his consulting activities. It included the productivity lost during months of department turmoil, the damage to employee morale and trust, and the opportunity costs of talented people who left or disengaged because of his leadership. Looking back on the entire experience, I'm grateful that Richard's true character was eventually exposed, and that I was able to play a role in holding him accountable for his misconduct. But I'm also aware that many employees who face similar situations never get the kind of vindication I experienced, and that workplace bullying and abuse often go unaddressed because victims don't have access to the kind of evidence I accidentally obtained. The recording I made of Richard's phone conversation was crucial in exposing his misconduct and protecting myself from his continued attempts to destroy my career. But I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time to overhear information that revealed his hidden motivations. Most employees who are being targeted by abusive managers don't have access to smoking gun evidence that clearly demonstrates their boss's bad faith and ulterior motives. This is why I think it's so important for companies to take complaints about management misconduct seriously and to investigate thoroughly rather than simply dismissing employee concerns as personality conflicts or performance issues. Richard's public humiliation of me was allowed to continue for months because senior leadership assumed his criticism was legitimate and that I was simply having trouble adapting to his management style. If the company had investigated the pattern of Richard's behavior more carefully, they might have discovered his conflicts of interest and ethical violations before he was able to cause so much damage to individual employees and to the organization as a whole. They also might have recognized that his targeting of specific employees was strategic rather than performance-based, and that his management decisions were motivated by self-interest rather than business objectives. The experience has also made me more conscious of the importance of building strong professional relationships and maintaining detailed records of my work and interactions with supervisors. When Richard was systematically undermining my reputation, having colleagues who could vouch for my competence and having documentation of my actual performance were crucial in demonstrating that his criticisms were unfounded and potentially malicious. I now make sure to document important conversations with supervisors, save copies of performance reviews and project feedback, and maintain relationships with colleagues and clients who can provide objective assessments of my work quality and professional conduct. These practices might seem paranoid or defensive, but they provide important protection against managers who might try to distort or misrepresent your contributions for their own purposes. The situation with Richard also taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong about a workplace dynamic or management relationship. I spent months wondering whether his criticism was legitimate and whether I needed to change my approach or improve my performance, when I should have been questioning his motivations and looking for evidence of bias or misconduct. When someone's treatment of you seems disproportionate to any actual problems with your work, or when their criticism feels personal rather than professional, it's worth investigating whether there might be hidden factors influencing their behavior. Abusive managers often target competent employees who they perceive as threats to their authority or who might be able to expose their shortcomings or misconduct. The most satisfying aspect of how the situation resolved wasn't Richard's career, destruction, or legal consequences, though those were certainly appropriate given his actions. It was the validation that came from having the truth about his character and motivations revealed, and from being recognized by my colleagues and company leadership as someone who'd been unfairly targeted rather than legitimately criticized. Being publicly vindicated after months of having my competence and character questioned restored my professional confidence and helped me rebuild the reputation that Richard had tried so hard to destroy. It also demonstrated to other employees that standing up to abusive management and seeking justice for workplace mistreatment could be successful, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. The requests for help that Richard made after his termination were pathetic attempts to manipulate someone he'd spent months trying to destroy, and refusing to assist him felt like the final chapter in a story about justice and accountability. He'd shown no genuine remorse for his misconduct or recognition of the harm he'd caused, so helping him avoid consequences would have been a betrayal of my own values and an injustice to other employees who'd been affected by his behavior. The contrast between Richard's arrogant, domineering behavior when he held authority over me and his desperate, pleading attitude when he needed my help revealed the true weakness and insecurity that had motivated his bullying all along. People who abuse their power are often fundamentally weak individuals who use aggression and intimidation to mask their own inadequacies and fears. Today, I'm in the strongest position of my career, leading technical initiatives that I'm passionate about and working with colleagues who respect and value my contributions. The experience with Richard was traumatic and professionally damaging in the short term, but it ultimately made me stronger, more aware, and more committed to creating positive workplace environments where competent people can thrive without fear of retaliation or abuse. The boss who humiliated me in front of everyone did indeed end up begging for his job back, though not in the way the title might suggest. He never actually asked to be rehired by Dataflow Solutions, because his criminal conviction and professional disgrace made that impossible. Instead, he begged me to help him salvage whatever might be left of his career and reputation by defending his conduct in legal proceedings that could have sent him to prison. In refusing to help him, I completed my own transformation from victim to survivor, and I demonstrated that integrity and professional competence ultimately triumph over manipulation and abuse, even when justice takes longer to arrive than we'd like. Sometimes the most important victories aren't about revenge or public vindication. They're about maintaining your values and refusing to compromise your principles, even when doing so might provide short-term advantages or satisfy desires for retaliation. The experience taught me that workplace bullies often create the conditions for their own downfall, because their abusive behavior is usually motivated by character flaws and hidden agendas that eventually expose them to consequences they can't manipulate or control. Richard's need to protect his consulting fraud led him to target competent employees who might discover his misconduct, but this strategy ultimately provided the evidence that brought about his professional destruction. If you've made it through this entire story, I hope it serves as encouragement for anyone who's dealing with workplace abuse or professional retaliation from supervisors or colleagues who seem to have all the power. Justice may not come quickly or easily, But abusive people often carry the seeds of their own destruction, and maintaining your integrity and competence while documenting their misconduct can position you to survive and ultimately thrive when their true character is eventually revealed.